Hi everyone and welcome back to Trapped by Love. If you're new here, my name is Emma Carrington. We discuss cases of domestic abuse and domestic homicide on this channel. I will also add an extra disclaimer here that this episode involves child abuse and murder. So if that's not the kind of content you are looking for, I completely understand. Thanks for stopping by. Also, this episode contains images and names of Indigenous people who have died. My aim in covering these cases is to honour the victims of these crimes and also to get their stories out there in the hopes of warning others who may face similar situations. So in saying that, I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the victims or their loved ones. I have done my very best to thoroughly research these cases and to get the details as accurate as possible. The hope is that the more people who recognise the red flags and warning signs of abusive relationships, the less prevalent these cases will be in the future. Knowledge is power, and we need to know what to be on the lookout for to be able to protect ourselves and each other. I'd also like to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below or let me know your thoughts on Twitter @LoveTrapPod. So let's go ahead and get into this week's case. I'll be presenting this case a little differently. This one won't focus so much on the red flags in the lead up and within an abusive relationship, but it's more to help people understand why women, and especially Indigenous women, don't call for help in domestic violence situations. Today's heartbreaking case is that of Tamica and Charlie Mullaley. In March of 2013, Tamica Mullaley's 10-month-old son Charlie was tortured for 15 hours by her new partner, Mervyn Bell, after he had left her naked and bleeding on a street in Broome in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. That night had started out a festive one. It was Tamica's dad's birthday, and they had gathered to celebrate. After they'd spent some time together, Tamica was heading out. As she was getting ready, she asked her father, Ted, if she could leave Charlie, her 10-month-old son, at home with him. After this night, Ted would be heartbroken that he'd said no. He's explained since that he'd said no in the hopes that, quote, it would make her behave herself and come home at a reasonable time. Tamica gathered Charlie up and they set out to see some friends. When Tamica arrived at a friend's place, she placed the sleeping baby in the living room and headed outside to have a drink with her friends. Her partner, Mervyn Bell, was there, and Tamica had heard that while she'd been away in Perth, Mervyn had been cheating on her. She confronted him and the exchange got heated. By Tamica's account, Mervyn was being an asshole, so she decided to head to a friend's place down the street to borrow a stroller so she could take Charlie home. While Tamica was walking down the road, Mervyn drove slowly behind her with his headlights trained on her. That was until he launched from the car and attacked. He punched her repeatedly as though he was defending a title in a boxing match, and he tore at her clothing until she was naked and bleeding in the street. A lady from a neighbouring house came out and Mervyn took off back to his car while the lady, who happened to be a nurse, wrapped Tamica's bloodied body in a sheet as she cowered in the carport. But Mervyn wasn't done. He aimed the car at the two women and drove at speed towards them, almost hitting them both. The nurse then told him to leave them alone, then that she'd called the police. With this, Mervyn left the scene. The nurse had also called Tamica's dad, Ted, who arrived moments after the police. Tamica was distraught and embarrassed. She didn't want to talk to the police, and she told them so. She just wanted her dad.
She wasn't being a good victim. She wasn't standing there in the sheet, dripping in blood and trying to control all this emotion that was going on with her and say, oh, hello, yes, no, I want to tell you this is what happened. She said, I want my dad, I want my dad. And they decided she couldn't have her dad. The two policemen, one woman and one man, they said that Tamica spat. And then they said, that's assault, you're getting arrested.
but the police pressed her. Even though they'd been given an account by the nurse who'd called them initially, and Ted had told them that it was Mervyn Bell who'd beaten his daughter, the police kept hounding the confused and traumatised Tamica for further information, seemingly not taking her wishes or injuries into account. With all the commotion, two of Tamica's friends had brought Charlie down to the scene and he was passed to his mother. However, he was taken back by the police and handed back off to the girls. This police encounter continued and ended with Tamica apparently swearing at police and locking herself in her dad's ute. When police smashed the passenger window of Ted's car, she got out and allegedly spat at an officer and was subsequently charged with assault. The police were so unconcerned with Tamica's injuries that they were going to take her straight to the cells. But Ted insisted that they take her to hospital. They eventually, reluctantly, agreed to this, but Ted was worried that they were just telling him what he wanted to hear, so he followed them to make sure Tamica got the care she needed. Because of this, he wasn't able to take Charlie. Once he was sure that Tamica was at the hospital and getting treatment, he'd headed back to the house where Charlie had been and found that he wasn't there. Ted was told that he'd been picked up by Mervyn Bell. This was alarming to Ted. He immediately raced back to the hospital and found Constable Carberry sitting in his patrol car outside the hospital. Ted ran up to the constable and said, "I need your help. He's taken the baby." He explained that Mervyn was not Charlie's father and he feared that he was going to kill the baby. Ted says that Constable Carberry responded, "Well, we haven't got any resources." Ted was in a panic and asked him what he meant. And the constable replied, "Well, we're here looking after your daughter because she's under arrest." Ted pleaded for him to send someone else to look for Charlie, but the response he got was, "How many cars do you think we've got? We've got one here and one back at the station doing business." Ted later learned that the car back at the station was there because the officer was writing up charges against Tamica for assaulting them and against Ted himself for hindering police. Not exactly time-sensitive work, if you could deem it necessary at all. Ted then raced over to the police station to report Charlie's abduction. He also told them that Mervyn was driving one of Ted's cars and gave them all the details, begging them to look for him. But Acting Sergeant Darren Connor, who was on the front desk that night, said Ted came in smelling of alcohol and who knows what else, and that he was behaving aggressively and erratically. This, however, does not line up with the CCTV footage of the encounter or Ted's own account, and Ted has said on numerous occasions that he hasn't had a drink in decades. Unfortunately, this is a very unfair stereotype that seems to have called the validity of Ted's report and his integrity into question, hindering this investigation from the outset. Ted left the station, still concerned for his grandson's safety and feeling as though he had not been taken seriously. So he called 000, and I'll play the audio clip of that for you now.
Police emergency, how may I help?
My daughter's friend has stolen the baby. I tried to tell the police here that they're not listening.
Well, do you know where he is?
If I knew where he was, I wouldn't be ringing anybody. I would be calling him myself.
And so where are you now?
I'm driving looking for him. It's my grandson, 9-month-old grandson.
Hang on a sec. Have you gone to the police station already?
Yes, I have.
So why are you calling 000 now?
Because I'm not happy with their response. They don't think I'm serious. I need someone to stress on them. They tell me they only got one vehicle on the road.
But that's not going to change if you ring me, sir. I can't ring them.
Is this phone call recorded?
It is.
Well, can you tell them that their grandfather is very, very worried and get someone to take me serious that this guy is going to kill my grandson?
And so what's your name?
Ted Mullaley.
I will actually contact the sergeant myself for you, okay?
Can you tell him
Thank you.
how important it is, please?
Yes, I will. Thank you for your call.
Is that it?
That's it.
No one would help me. I was scared. But in my wildest dreams, I never thought he would do what he did to baby.
The operator called Broome Police Station and spoke with Constable Joel Wright. When she relayed that Mr. Mullaley was extremely concerned for his grandson, the constable told her that he knew all about Ted and that he'd basically been obstructing police all night. When the operator asked if anyone was going to call Ted, she was told that he'd speak with his supervisor, but seeing as Ted had already taken up 2 hours of police time, he didn't know if anyone would be contacting him. It is so frustrating that no one is taking this man's fears seriously. I'm sorry, but people don't go around calling police to say, so-and-so has taken the baby and I fear that they're going to kill them, as a prank or as a nuisance call. This poor man. Ted ended up receiving a bunch of garbled texts from Mervyn and headed back to the police station with them, hoping they could use them to find the abductor's location. But he was told by Constable Wright that it would be too expensive. Ted said he'd pay the $800 to run the check. Wright once again refused, saying it would take too long. So again, they just fobbed him off. There was nothing more he could do that night. He'd checked all the bush around town, anywhere that he could think that Mervyn would be. So he was heading home to rest up and return to the search in the morning. As he walked the 100 metres from the police station to his home, he heard a car driving slowly behind him. When he turned around, he saw Constable Wright following him in a patrol car and shining a spotlight on him. Ted said he swore at him, telling him to stop shining that effing light on me, and the constable replied, "And you stop ringing 000 too." The police told this man to stop calling 000. This is insane. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Sergeant William Withers came in to begin his shift. Now, acting Sergeant Connors, the one who'd earlier described Ted as drunk and aggressive, says he briefed Sergeant Withers on what had transpired over the night. However, Sergeant Withers says he has no recollection of this. So when he begins work that morning, the sergeant had no idea that Mervyn Bell had brutally assaulted Tamica and abducted Charlie, or of Ted's repeated attempts to get police to look for him. Ted went back to the station that morning hoping to hear that the police had begun their search for Charlie, because by now the little boy had been missing for 6 hours. Ted was horrified to hear that they hadn't even started to look for the 10-month-old baby. Ted's sister works in child protection, so he knew this was nowhere near the normal response to a child going missing. When Tamica heard what had happened with Charlie, against doctor's advice, she checked herself out of the hospital immediately. In severe pain from her extensive injuries, Tamica ran 2 kilometres to her friend's house to borrow his car and then proceeded to run all around town, looking anywhere that she thought that Mervyn may be. But in her heart, she knew that he'd left town and he'd taken her baby boy with him. Everyone in town knew Charlie was missing. Ted had called around looking everywhere for him. Ted also figured that Mervyn had left town and believed that he had headed out on the Port Hedland Road. He told police this, but they weren't interested in looking in either direction. Yeah, that's right. I said either direction. There's only 2 roads out of town, but police would not head in either direction or even call the police in either direction to tell them to keep an eye out for the car or for Mervyn. It turns out that Ted was right. At 5:45, Mervyn pulled into the closed Pardue Roadhouse, which is 460 kilometres south of Broome on the road to Port Hedland. He tried to steal some petrol by cutting a hose, and when that didn't work, because duh, shocker, he drove around until they opened. He then filled up and took off without paying. At 6:40, the staff at the roadhouse called to report the theft, but were told by police that they didn't attend driveaways. After speeding off with the stolen fuel, 2 separate motorists called the police to advise them of this vehicle being driven erratically. But no one outside of Broome knew that Charlie was missing or that the 80 series Land Cruiser had been stolen along with the child. So the police missed this chance to intercept Bell and retrieve Charlie. It wasn't until 10 a.m. that police went to interview the two women that had been caring for Charlie when Mervyn had taken him. And even though an officer had been instructed to, he never called the police station in either direction to alert them of Charlie's abduction or to give Mervyn Bell's or the car's description. Just before 11 a.m, Sergeant Withers called the police operations centre in Perth and explained the situation to Inspector Trevor Davis and told him that they were looking to scale it up to a child abduction scenario because the child's grandfather had informed them that Mervyn Bell had threatened the child's mother that he would take and kill the child. Inspector Davis replied that unless there was evidence of these threats, a statement from Tamica herself, for example, there was nothing Perth could do. At around 11:20 that morning, one of Ted's truck drivers had spotted a car that belonged to Ted. This was the car that Bell was driving, in Roebourne, 800 kilometres south of Broome. Ted raced back to the police station to give them this update. He reported that Bell had been seen on the road to Karratha, 40 kilometres past Roebourne. The police's response was that they'd set up a roadblock in Carnarvon, which is 600 kilometres past Karratha. Ted was fuming. He's quoted in Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do, saying, "I ran amok in the police station, actually. I abused them, to be honest with you." I don't think I can blame him. I'd be irate by this point. This is nearly 12 hours since he'd initially reported that his grandson had been abducted, and they were going to set up a roadblock hours away from the last sighting. Ted's sister, the one who worked in child protection, had flown in from Perth that day to help because Ted felt he was getting nowhere, as you would, and she ended up calling a homicide detective that she knew through work and explained what was happening. He advised them not to speak to anyone else and told them he'd be on the next flight. Ted says the detective was absolutely devastated about how they were treating them. At 12:57, over 13 hours after Charlie's abduction had been reported, Broome police finally put out the alert to all districts. 13 hours. Less than an hour after this, while Ted and Tamica were sitting with Broome police, Mervyn Bell raced into the Fortescue Roadhouse in Mardy, which is 930 kilometres south of Broome. He ran in through the doors with the baby in his arms. He laid Charlie on a table in front of a patron named Gavin Duff, and Bell was yelling Charlie's name and screaming for an ambulance, and then he tried to resuscitate the baby. Poor Gavin Duff sat there looking at the child in front of him. He says there was significant bruising on his body, a large welt on the side of his head, and a mark on the centre of his chest where it had started to peel. As Mervyn got more and more worked up, Gavin took over trying to revive the infant, and when paramedics arrived, they tried to find a pulse. But Charlie was dead. After being with Mervyn Bell for 15 hours, the precious 10-month-old child had succumbed to a catastrophic number of injuries. It said that he had over 100 injuries on a 10-month-old baby. The police back in Broome told Tamica and Ted that they'd found Charlie and that he was on his way to Karratha by ambulance. As Ted and Tamica were getting into the ute to head to Karratha, two police officers approached them and just bluntly said to Tamica, "Your baby's gone." Ted then goes on to say, "She just lost it." Tamica says, "I ran off crying and screaming. I didn't want anyone near me. I ran to the church and I was just sitting in the church crying." Tamica's mum, who'd been heading to Broome to be with her, rerouted to Karratha when she heard that Charlie had been found. However, hospital staff wouldn't let her see his tiny broken body. The post-mortem revealed appalling and heartbreaking injuries. These devastating injuries included third-degree burns, severe lacerations, abrasions, bruising, internal bleeding, a broken arm, a broken leg, and genital mutilation. This is just so tragic. Tamica and Ted had begged the police to help find Charlie, but they refused. It is also said that Ted and Tamica even had to go home and show the police a birth certificate to prove that Mervyn Bell wasn't Charlie's father and that Tamica was, in fact, his mum. They seemed to have no regard for baby Charlie's safety, and unfortunately, while they were stuffing around, he was being repeatedly tortured. Charlie Mullaley's memorial was held a few days after his passing, and family flew in from all around the country. The service was held at Our Lady, Queen of Peace Cathedral, and Tamica wrote a poem in tribute to her baby boy in the memorial service program titled My Child. It reads as follows: "So precious, so innocent, not yet knowing what life holds. Much to learn, much to see, much to hear, much to need. Loving, wanting, adoring and demanding. I love you, my child, my second son, my baby, my dear Charlie boy." Family and friends sang songs and played guitar during the service, celebrating a precious life cut short. In 2014, Mervyn Bell was accused and stood trial for taking the child from his mother on March 19th, 2013, and fatally abusing him over a 15-hour period. He was fighting charges of murder and sexual assault. There are no words for this piece of garbage. Bell gave evidence saying that the baby's injuries were sustained when he fell from a moving car as it went through a roundabout, when he laid on hot rocks by a riverbed, and that he died after he went underwater at a river. Now, I'm sorry, but a 10-month-old baby can't do any of those things on his own. You despicable piece of... Defence counsel John Myers said despite the prosecution saying his client had lied to police and showed no care for the child, there was evidence to the contrary. The lawyer pointed to the footage of Mr. Bell rushing into the roadhouse and trying to resuscitate the baby as evidence that his client cared for the welfare of the baby. Mr. Myers went on to say the prosecution's case had simply failed to prove Mr. Bell deliberately caused any of the child's injuries that could have been a cause of death or endangered his life. Are you for real? Are you for real? I don't know how some of these defense attorneys sleep at night, because that is just beyond ridiculous. Breathe. Breathe, Emma. It's okay. Take a breath. Ultimately, Mervyn Bell was found guilty of the rape and murder of 10-month-old Charlie Mullaley. At the sentencing, Justice John McKeachney said, "Once in every 10 years, a crime is so evil that it shocks the public." He then sentenced Bell to life in prison with a minimum of 27 years. He didn't make it anywhere near that, though, because 9 months after being sentenced, he killed himself in Casuarina prison. This was not the end of things, though. About a month later, Ted and Tamica were back in court. Broome police had decided to proceed with the assault and obstruction charges against them from the night that Charlie was abducted. I have no words. To add insult to injury, Magistrate Stephen Sharrett found them both guilty. He said he felt that Tamica was, quote, in control of her senses because she was worried that her child would see her battered and bloodied body. He then went on to commend Ted for his candour and honesty when he freely admitted to trying to prevent police from arresting his daughter. I'm sorry, but how freaking condescending. He then gave Ted a criminal conviction and a $300 fine. Tamica was given a 12-month suspended sentence, and the magistrate said, oh so graciously, if ever there was a time for the court to be merciful, it's this matter today. The Mullaley family made a complaint and the case was investigated by the Corruption and Crime Commission, the CCC, into whether Charlie's death could have been avoided if the police had acted in a timely and professional manner. In its report, the CCC said while there was a delayed and ineffective response by individual officers on the night of Charlie's disappearance, it was impossible to know whether a more rapid response could have saved the baby. The family also requested that the state coroner conduct a public inquest into Charlie's death to examine the role of police in the case, but it was refused. The next stop was the Supreme Court. They argued that an inquest should be held to determine if the baby's death was caused or contributed to by any action of a member of the police force. Justice Renee Lemire said he was not satisfied that it is necessary or desirable in the interests of justice to order an inquest. He said that the allegation that police contributed to the death by failing to protect him at the scene of the assault was not supported by the evidence. Justice Lemire said that the friends who were given the child were caring for him when the police arrived and were doing so with the authority of his parent or guardian. He said an inquest was not likely to produce any more evidence in the case or clarify the facts around the baby's death, noting that it was caused by injuries inflicted intentionally and culpably by Bell. He goes on to say that while the coroner might make recommendations about police policies and procedures, he says that that's not enough of a reason to order a public hearing, basically saying that the function of an inquest is to inquire about the death and to make findings, and any recommendations that come from that are sort of secondary. It's not like the reason that they conduct these things. He also ridiculously said that an inquest would cause inconvenience, hurt and pain to some of those required to give evidence about the scene of the assault. I'm sorry. What? It might upset them. We just take them off the witness list. What? Freaking moron. Tamica said the family had been left devastated by the decision. They weren't present in court when the decision was made. Tamica says Charlie's murderer got an inquest, but his victim, a tiny baby, does not. She's referring to the investigation into Bell's suicide in the prison. She goes on to say, "This is another slap in the face for me and my family. It's just heartbreaking. The police arrested me and charged my dad for protecting me when I was the victim of a vicious bashing. The police left my baby at the scene without asking about his safety. The police refused to look for my baby when my dad and I told them that he'd been abducted. It's clear to me that little black lives don't matter in Western Australia." That is heartbreaking. Dr. Hannah McGlade, an associate professor at Curtin University and Noongar woman, has been advocating for the Mullaley family and said the case highlighted systematic failures in the system. She said it was shocking that an inquest had been refused by the Supreme Court, as violence against Indigenous women and children was a human rights matter of international concern. She says there still has not been justice for the family, and the police involved have not yet been held to account. While the CCC had undertaken an inquiry, the outcome was disappointing, and a recent Parliament inquiry into the CCC showed they were failing to properly respond to police violence against Aboriginal people and were not engaging properly with the Aboriginal community. Tamica has been trying to get a meeting with Western Australia's Attorney General, John Quigley, regarding the case, but she hasn't been able to. A spokesperson for the Attorney General said, "The family are welcome to contact the office with their request. The attorney respects the decision of the court and will not be making a comment." Okay. So the family's fight to get justice for how this case was initially handled is ongoing. There is a petition, I'll link it down below or in the show notes. Please take a minute and sign it. This poor family has been through so much and they're still fighting an uphill battle. Okay, I've attempted, probably not entirely successfully, but I've attempted to keep my thoughts and opinions to myself until this point. So I get to a degree why the police may have been happy to leave Charlie with the people that Tamica had previously left him in the care of. And I get why Ted couldn't take him initially, because he was so focused on Tamica and her injuries. And this is horrible and heartbreaking to say as an Australian, but there are so many Indigenous deaths in custody that I get that he had to advocate for his daughter, because the police were going to take her straight to jail, and this would have meant the end of her life. And that's not an exaggeration. That's what the doctor that she saw that night had said. So I understand all of that. What I don't understand is them not taking down the information regarding Tamica's attack, or that they were so focused on charging her that they took absolutely no notice of what anyone said about the attack on her. They didn't take any details down about Mervyn Bell or any of that. They were forcing this obviously traumatized and injured woman to give her account of what happened when they already had a statement from the witnesses, the nurse that had called for the police to help. So they had all the initial information. They had people telling them who had done this, and yet they were so focused on boxing Tamica in and getting this statement from her. And she was so traumatized and confused, as she obviously would be. She had major injuries. She's wrapped in a sheet, exposed, like everything had been stripped from her, and she's being chased by the police so that they can get her account of being beaten. She's obviously been beaten. She's covered in blood. All she wanted was to be left alone. Why wasn't she treated as a victim? Why was she treated so insensitively that in the end they treated her as a perpetrator? It just blows my mind and it hurts my heart. And then when it all played out and there was no doubt that Mervyn had taken Charlie, why on earth did the police do nothing? Why were they sitting on their hands doing paperwork to charge Tamica rather than putting a report out to say, find this car, which was Ted's, as well as his grandchild? Even if they weren't concerned with the child's safety, the guy had stolen a car. It's just so unbelievable. They could have at least looked or put out an alert. It's only 2 roads in and out of town. He's gone one of 2 ways. And even Ted was aware of which direction he'd gone due to the fact that he was receiving messages from him. So he went in the direction that had mobile reception. I guess Ted's detective skills are better than those of the police. This is all just, oh my gosh, it makes my blood boil. Take a breath. It is beyond hideous. And the fact that they can say, okay, yes, I get Mervyn Bell is 100% the reason Charlie died. I get that. We get that. However, this could have been stopped early on in the whole mess. They didn't need a guard on Tamica while she was in hospital. She wasn't going anywhere. And if she did go somewhere, where is she going to go? They're in this town in the middle of nowhere. Where on earth was she going to go? Her family was there. The minute she could, she discharged herself. It wasn't like they took her to jail then. She discharged herself to go and look for her child. So what was the point of having the car stationed out the front of the hospital and the other one back at the station writing up charges against this mother and victim? Oh my gosh, it is so frustrating. I'm sorry, I'm ranting now and I'm going to stop. Okay, I'm going to stop ranting. I promise. Okay, one of the resources that I used for this case was Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do. It's about power and control and domestic abuse. It has a section covering Charlie's murder, which is heartbreaking. There's also an SBS 3-part documentary series in conjunction with the book, and I will leave a link to both these in the description box and show notes if you're looking to check either of those out. The documentary series is fantastic. However, there are a few bits and pieces that really pissed me off. Things like when they were showing things from the perpetrator's point of view. No, No. 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 These guys feeling sorry for themselves that they have to work so hard to not be perpetrators. Oh my gosh, no. I got to the point that I tried to call SBS to complain. But overall, it gave great information, and at least they're having the conversation. So that's a good thing, right? Anyway, my friends, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me. Again, check out the links below, sign the petition. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so please don't forget to like and subscribe, rate and review, and drop a comment below for my friends watching on YouTube. Let's also continue the discussion over on social media. Join us on Twitter at LoveTrapPod or Instagram at Surviving the Love Bomb. Trapped by Love is a Surviving the Love Bomb production. If you'd like more information about recognising abusive relationships, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, Surviving the Love Bomb, or just head over and check it out. You can also watch these podcasts on the Trapped by Love YouTube channel. I believe that this is a really important topic. I say it every week, but it needs more exposure so we can all stay safe from abusive relationships. Well, again, that's all I have for you today. Thank you again for joining me this week, and until next time, please take care of yourselves and be kind to one another. Bye.